Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the League of Women Voters General Meeting on Transportation. From here to there, how and who pays. Tonight, our topic is transportation, ground transportation in particular. You know, transportation issues have been on the League of Women Voters position agenda for many years. At the state level, it is incorporated with our land use positions. We have a robust transportation position among our regional positions. Every year at program planning time, transportation is discussed. Fittingly, always a very robust discussion. This meeting is a response to our members. Clearly, this topic is far beyond a single meeting. But tonight we will focus on funding and the many aspects of managing our system. We do expect, though, that other issues will surface, both in the presentation and in questions. Everyone has a unique and very important transportation story. The way the meeting will operate is that we will proceed with all four of our presentations. Questions cards will be available from Barbara Stallions and Marnie Lonsdale. Raise your hand for a card, and when you want for a question card, and then when you also have completed your question. Following the presentation, panel members will have an opportunity to question each other. Then we will open the meeting for audience questions. We have with us tonight Leah Treat, head of the Bureau of Transportation for the City of Portland, and Greg Jones, a member of her staff. Leah and Greg, if you could stand up, please. I'm introducing them at this point because Leah and Greg will participate in the question period at the end of the presentations. So if you have questions about local transportation issues during the meeting, I just wanted you to know that they will be accepted and that we can respond. Our panel members tonight are part of an intricate web, principally of government organization, charged with planning, coordinating, funding, prioritizing, and managing our ground transportation system. We snuck in a futurist, too. Our panel includes George Beard, Alliance Manager for the Office of Research and Strategic Partnerships at PSU, Mark Frohnmayer from the Oregon Transportation Commission, Carlotta Collette, Metro Counselor, and Tobias Reed, Chair of the Oregon House Transportation and Economic Development Committee. George Beard is leading our panel. Mr. Beard is Alliance Manager for the Office of Research and Strategic Partnerships in the Hatfield School of Government at PSU. The office works to leverage the spirit of collaboration by identifying and cultivating public and private partnerships that address pressing metropolitan problems. Mr. Beard's professional interests focus on public sector innovation, performance improvement, and leadership development. During his 30-year career, Beard has divided his time between the public and private sectors, much of it involving the deployment of technology and the pursuit of innovation. Beard has worked for several technology and software firms, including Unisys, Oracle, and Retech in a variety of roles: global alliance management, global account management, corporate communications, and business development. He also has nearly 15 years of public sector experience, including time with the U.S. Department of Justice, Bonneville Power, the state of Oregon, and Multnomah County. George is going to lead us off tonight and talk a little bit about his perspectives on the future of urban transportation.
Ann, thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be with you here. My job is to I hope I can do this in less than 10 minutes because the real experts are the ones to my right and to your left. So my job is primarily to frame the challenges and the opportunities that we have, and then to let really more intelligent and thoughtful colleagues here weigh in on it. Let's go to the next slide, if we might. So my first observation to you, or my quick story, everyone has a transportation story indeed. Mine occurred this morning when I was leaving my home in Eastmoreland, not that far away from here, trying to get into downtown Portland, about a 5-mile commute that customarily, if I go off hours, I can do in about 12 minutes. Today it took me over 80 minutes. And I'm sure there was some construction going on, but literally I could not find my way. I felt like a rat in a maze. I could not find my way. The only open channel to get, as the crow flies, from the inner east side into the south end of downtown Portland would have been to take one of these famous amphicars that you might remember, for those of you old enough, back in the 60s, could also operate in water. You can tell from the sunshine today, clearly this was not the Willamette on a November day. But in any event, it got me thinking about the fact that when I moved here 35 years ago, one of my colleagues at Portland State, some of you may have known, Kay Corbett of the Corbett family, told me that she said Portland's a 10-minute town, by which she meant you could typically either drive or bike or walk to most places you would go. And then she added the qualifier in about 10 minutes, and she added the qualifier that the chances were pretty high you would run into somebody you know. That's part of our intimacy. But that commute time, that norm of 10 minutes, it seems to me, has extended to 20 minutes and 30 minutes and 40 minutes. And I don't know what your experience is, but mine is that traffic has become demonstrably more painful and a greater impediment to getting around. Now, rather than just complaining about it, the basis of my argument tonight is that how we move and how well we move people and freight will very much define our success as a region. And so, again, the august presenters here I'm sure will weigh in on that. But that's really key, that the past is not prologue. This isn't Dinah Shore in the 1950s singing about seeing the USA in a Chevrolet on brand new infrastructure. The situation has changed, and I'll highlight what I think some of those changes are. Let's go to the next slide. This is the world according to GARP. These are about 6 or 7 things that I think about, that I worry about. I was born in 1950, and at that time, the population of the planet was about 2.7 million. A lot of people, 2,700 million people. Today, it's just slightly north of 7 billion, 7,000 billion. And if, God willing, I get another 20 or 25 years left on my runway, it'll exceed 9 billion. That's more than tripling the population of the planet. That's a mega trend, and we have seen it. If you've been here for a while, you've seen our small and magnificent state growing, and the curve is going up. The second thing that's a key driver is the amount of urbanization that's occurred. Just recently, and for the first time in history, now fully half of the people on our planet live in cities or metropolitan areas, and that's the first time in history. And again, if I'm granted another 20 or 25 years, it's projected that nearly 2 out of every 3 people will live in cities. A third one, and you'll see a shot of this in a minute, but aging infrastructure. It's not the 50s, it's not the post-World War II era, it's not the Federal Highway Administration building interstates anymore. It's the fact in many cases we haven't set aside and harvested enough money to pay for that infrastructure. And there's a lot of whipping boys or subjects we could use. Because of where I live, I think the Selwood Bridge is emblematic of how some important infrastructure was let to slide. And I'm not here to complain about it. I salute the county for the great job they did in trying to cobble that together, but it was very difficult. And even the amount of cooperation, the willingness to participate in regional projects seems to have left us. That's one of the things that historically has been an advantage for us as a community, our sense of regionality. Let us not lose that going forward. Fourth one, I'm sure my friends will talk about gas revenue. The gas tax revenue is in decline in relative terms. And as we become as our fleet becomes more fuel efficient and maybe even more electrified, the likelihood is that our ability to raise the revenue to take care of the potholes on the streets and the bridges and all of the necessary repairs is very much in doubt. It's very stressed out at the moment. So that's a massive issue and one that'll be controversial. My next point is, I don't know how to say this in a nice way, so I just, for the sake of hyperbole and drama, I said, beware of water refugees. I've done a bit of work with a guy down at the Scripps Institute named Tim Barnett. He's a hydrologist, and he is the guy, he's probably one of the principal guys looking at the challenges behind Hoover Dam. Lake Powell and Lake Mead, for those of you who are following it, has dropped its water level by more than 100 feet just in the last decade. And Dr. Tim has projected in his modeling that those bodies of water could well go dry. There's a 50% chance, a coin flip's chance that they could go dry as soon as 2025. Now, what you'd say, well, what does that have to do with our transportation challenge and infrastructure here? Well, think about it. If Phoenix runs out of water, and Las Vegas is no longer able to send the water in the fountains up into the air where it can evaporate even quicker, and that water and that hydrogeneration that helps, support Southern California suddenly is taken offline, I would submit to you that we may end up with a migration problem that could make the Dust Bowl look like a picnic. And you want to ask yourself, not to be fatalistic, but if that were to come to pass, where would those people go? Do you think they'd come here? Our water situation isn't exactly cheery, and the snowpack is getting lighter and lighter all the time. But I would argue to you there's probably 3 destinations or 4 that water refugees from the Southwest might follow. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do it. It would be rational behavior, but they'd come to the Pacific Northwest. Some would try and get to Canada, and I think that would really stress our friendship with our northern neighbors. Some might go as far as New England, where there's some abundance of water, and the other one could be the great hope for Detroit. They might go to the Great Lakes. Seriously, if I were advising Detroit, that's the argument, the strategic argument I would make. They have suddenly an abundance of land, cheap land, and water. That could be really important in the next 15 or 20 years. So that's part of the backdrop. But if you take the primary drivers, rapid population growth and mass urbanization leads me to near the final point at the bottom of this slide, and that is that simply, whether we like our cars or not, cars in cities are not a good fit. They're not a comfortable fit, and the more population growth we have, the more stress we're going to have with individual modes of transportation as we have known and love it. And I don't know how you can get around that truth. I submit that's a truth. In fact, some of my friends from the automobile industry have privately told me that that's what they worry about. And so we'll talk about what that could mean. Finally, we have our economy is propelled in large measure by what the economists call a traded sector economy. It's outbound wheat going through the Port of Portland. It's inbound Toyotas and Hyundais. It's all the stuff that we manufacture. It's Girding Edlin doing consulting around the world. That's all the traded sector economy. And if you can't move goods, if Nike can't manage its supply chain and get all the product to the right place at the right time, in real time, agility, they're going to go somewhere else. And what our problem is, in part, is that personal transportation, personal cars compete with freight and the movement of goods concurrently. And we have a significant and painful discussion going on with the Columbia River crossing. I'm not here to bury Caesar nor to praise him, but we have to think about what does it mean as we get more cars in play and the need to move more freight in real time and with great agility. These are big issues, and if we don't solve them, we will all suffer together. That's why this is a big deal. Let's go quickly through the remaining ones. Here's the population numbers. Again, you can see it's more than tripled in my lifetime. And so, yeah, you can figure out I'm 63 years old, okay? Or it will by the end of my life. Mass urbanization of the planet. Next one. Infrastructure. How many of you have really looked at the crumbling concrete on the Selwood Bridge? It's pretty amazing. And I don't know how long it took to build the Selwood Bridge. I read recently that it took like 16 or 17 months to build the Empire State Building. Now, this is a big engineering feat to pull this off, but it's going to take us 4 or 5 years, you know, to cure this problem. So it's not like back in the 30s. There's environmental impact studies and, you know, rerouting traffic and all this stuff. It's very complex issues, but we can't let the Selwood Bridge happen to us again. It's too expensive. It's too painful. Let's go to the next one. Gas revenues. Who's going to talk about gas revenues a bit? Okay, so I won't even touch this one. It's big. Here's a picture I want you to remember. This is about the wild card, the water refugees. The white marks on the shot here show where the water was 10 years ago, and it's falling, and it's not just because it's evaporating. It's falling because it's being over-tapped, being over-consumed to water those golf courses in Phoenix. I'm sorry that sounds like a harsh editorial, but it's no more harsh than to put the water in the fountains in Las Vegas that evaporates in the air. It's just, I mean, what are we thinking? Let's go on to the next. Cars and cities. Here's what I'd like to leave you with, and then I'm going to just pass this on to, is Carlotta next or Mark? I think we're going to go around the horn. So there are occasions, and I'm not trying to pick at anyone's politics or their experience or their personal opinions, but, you know, we get mad at the bicyclists in town. But I say bravo for bike lanes. And because of the leadership that Portland has taken, we are a leader here, and every time you see the odometer that counts the bike traffic on the Hawthorne Bridge, that's somebody that's not riding in a car or taking up lane space from you. I say bravo for Max, whether you like the Orange Line or not, and I love it. I can't wait for it to come online. I don't know what the numbers are. It's something like 130,000 boardings per day that go on our electrified rail system here. That means people aren't riding in cars and congesting, you know, traffic and emitting tailpipe emissions. I say bravo for the Portland streetcar. I take it all the time. I like it. I salute the city of Portland for aspiring to build 20-minute neighborhoods that are designed the way we used to live and operate, where you can walk or take public transit or ride your bike to most of the places you customarily go. I say kudos to Metro, and I'm not here just to suck up to Carlotta, but because we have a regional governance structure, we can accomplish things together that we cannot do separately. And we have to stand up and support that. I say bravo for car sharing. If people are willing to abandon their car and share it and we get better utilizations, here's something to talk about when you have a drink at your cocktail party on Friday night. The average car sits around unused about 22 hours a day, taking up space, depreciating in place. And I'm not telling you to get rid of your cars, but you know, you look downtown and we have all of these, you know, these temples that, you know, that support automobiles taking up space. And going forward with the population growth and so forth, I'm not sure we can support that. So car sharing is a better use of space and vehicle assets than personal ownership. We get really tense about the fact that we're now building apartments and condominiums on the Inner East Side in particular that have little or no parking. It's creating terrible tension in our neighborhoods. But you know what? This could be very prescient. It could be 10, 20, and 30 years from now that we look at this and say, my God, somebody had the foresight and the courage to stand up and risk this. Because here's the final point that I would make to you. Social and civic innovations typically take 20 or 30 years. The life of a city operates in decades. It doesn't operate on annual birthdays like we do with our personal lives. I salute the courage of the men and women, the policy level decision makers that committed the Mount Hood Freeway money to building the MAX line, because we are different for it and better for it today than had that not happened. And the decisions that we make today will impact essentially and determine what our fate is with regard to mobility 10 and 20 and 30 years hence. So I'm a fan. I understand. I have anxiety about mobility and how we will move people and goods and freight in the future. But I also have high confidence that in the city of Portland and in the metropolitan region and in the metro government and in the Oregon Department of Transportation and in the legislature, we have men and women who we have elected and selected who have the courage to be able to risk success with some new ways to get the job done, because I'm here to tell you, I don't believe the old ways are going to be able to sustain us. And that's my pitch to you. I give you Mark Frohnmayer.
Thank you very, very much, George. I think you got us off to a great start, and we appreciate it very much. Mark Frohnmayer sits on the Oregon Transportation Commission. The commission establishes state transportation policy. It guides the planning, development, and management of the statewide integrated transportation network. Mark is also currently serving on the Oregon Passenger Rail Leadership Council, recently appointed by Governor Kitzhaber to guide the Oregon Passenger Rail Environmental Impact Statement project. Mr. Frohnmayer served on the Oregon Governor's Alternate Fuel Vehicle Infrastructure Working Group in 2009 and was peer selected as one of the Pacific Northwest's clean technology pivotal leaders. Frohnmayer is a business entrepreneur as well and founded RC Moto in October 2007 to bring quality, affordable, sustainable vehicles to the public. He's also spent 11 years in the computer games industry. His first startup was Garage Games. Welcome, Mr. Frohnmayer, and please don't hesitate to tell us a little bit about RC Moto.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll tease to that near the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for having me tonight. The topic was pretty broad: demands, challenges, and the future of transportation. Fit that into 15 minutes. I'll do my best. So go ahead and hit the next slide. This is what at the commission we call the mountain graph. And it describes the various funding mechanisms going into the state's transportation improvement programs. We are now on the downslope of the funding mountain, picking up pace as we ski down the hill. And what is driving this is something that actually George talked about a little bit. Go ahead and go to the next slide. There are actually a few different factors. One of them is declining, the revenue that we use to pay for the roads comes from taxes on gasoline, largely. And that revenue source is declining for three reasons. One is that vehicle efficiency is improving, and is actually the corporate fuel economy average for vehicles will increase dramatically over the next 10 years by federal mandate. People are also driving less. So the kind of traditional VMT graph of up and to the right is called into serious question at this point. And then finally, everything that we're building, the costs of all of those materials and labor costs and so on are all increasing dramatically as well. So the combination of those three things is causing a serious bleed out on the trust fund. And if you go to the next slide, the ultimate impact of that is that our pavement quality over the course of the next 10, 15 years is projected to decline substantially. The bulk of our bridges, as George alluded to in terms of aging infrastructure, are expected to go into a distressed state over the course of the next several decades. And we don't have the revenue source in place to actually properly address that problem. If you go to the next slide. Something that we also weren't aware of in Oregon when we built out the bulk of our transportation system here is that we live in the Cascadia subduction zone, which is an area where major earthquakes happen about once every 300 years. And one of those is due. The last one was about 300 years ago. So we're expected to face a major earthquake within the next 50 years, about again, a coin flip, that in this area we'll face a major earthquake and about a 10% chance that it will be a catastrophic earthquake. The impact of that earthquake on because of the indirect cost of transportation is expected to be hundreds of billions of dollars. And to actually just armor up our key lifeline routes that will be how we actually get the rebuilding supplies in and address the catastrophe on the ground, it's about $2 billion worth of work just to armor up those key lifeline routes around the state. If you go to the next slide. And we have a hugely pressing problem in terms of climate change. The state has very aggressive goals as far as reducing the impact statewide of our contribution to climate change, and transportation is a huge piece of that. Nationwide, the transportation sector is about 27% of the GHG emissions. In Oregon, it's actually higher because we get a lot of our power from hydro. So when you add up all of these problems, we have major problems that we're facing, and we have a declining revenue source to deal with it. Go ahead and hit the next slide. One of the elements, just sort of as an anecdote here, is the work that we're doing on the EIS to improve rail service up and down the Willamette Valley. It's a multi-year process. We started, I want to say, a little more than a year ago, to identify ways to improve passenger rail, add high-speed rail between Eugene and Portland and on to Seattle. And we're moving forward in the process, but at the same time, we don't have a funding mechanism in place that's sustainable to pay for the train service that we have today, which, and I actually rode up here on the train this afternoon. It is unfortunate to me that I live in a place, let me say that a little bit differently. It is unfortunate that the place where we live has train service that is worse than train service in third world countries. And that is no criticism of the fine folks at the Department of Transportation that are working on working on passenger rail in the state. It's simply that we don't dedicate funds to having good train service. So our trains are second class on the freight railroads. The frequency of service is very low within the valley. Trains have to wait for freight trains to go, and so on. And so when we start looking at how do we get passenger vehicles off of the road so that we can better utilize our entire transportation system, we don't even have some of the very basic intercity capabilities that you would find in Croatia or Mexico or wherever else. So go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the challenges that we have there is that actually addressing climate change is made much more difficult by the fact that the gas tax is enshrined within the Constitution. So, and this is a huge challenge, partly because we want to make sure that we have a very sustainable source of funding for our roads. It's the reason it was put there in the first place. But since people are driving less and people are driving more fuel-efficient vehicles, the gas tax isn't doing its job at serving our basic road system. And it's not doing any job at all to help mitigate the externalized costs of greenhouse gas emissions. So go ahead, next. We are not unaware of this. The department has been working for about the last 10 years on a solution to part of the problem. So we've just started a pilot program for what is called the road user fee, and that is it's the next generation of fee structure for funding the roads. Right now, trucks pay a weight mile tax, which is the weight of the truck puts it in a particular category, and then for every mile that truck drives on the road, they pay a fee per mile. This is the same basic concept of what trucks already do in Oregon, just applied to passenger vehicles. Especially important for things like electric cars that have no gasoline input at all. So, and while we want to help spur the adoption of electric vehicles, we also want to have a sustainable road system. So we're piloting this right now. Go ahead and go to the next slide. But in order to really stop the bleed, we've got to make it, this is still some years out, but we've got to make it apply to all passenger vehicles. Ultimately, we want to index that price. Well, I should say, what is on the screen here is one potential antidote for this particular problem, which is put a road user fee. Basically, you pay by the mile instead of by the gallon. And that VMT is indexed to construction cost inflation. So this is the recipe for stopping the bleed of the funding source for the roads. And then, if we want to really get serious about climate change and putting price signals in the marketplace for emissions, we need to swap the mechanism that is in the Constitution now, which is a declining revenue source on gas taxes, and swap it for a sustaining source on VMT. So it is possible over the duration to come up with a long-term sustainable funding mechanism. And what we're doing right now is proving the beginnings of that possibility. Go ahead and go to the next. But in the meantime, we have to figure out how to deal with the resources that we have today. So this is a graph that I found on the internet, and this is one of the problems that we have, is that the projections that we use are, if you look at the years up to 2005, it's almost a straight line. It's just up and to the right. People are driving more, people are driving more, people are driving more year over year over year. And then about in 2005, it starts to flatten out. And if you look at the trend since 2007, it's a small slope downhill. If you look at what young people today are doing, the young urbanites who are taking the bus and riding the Max and walking and riding their bikes, they're not adopting cars, they're not buying cars, they're not wanting to drive. A lot of people are telecommuting, working from home. And so there's the potential that we'll see actually a very sharp fall off in vehicle miles traveled. And while that will help address some of the problems that George talked about in terms of congestion in the city core and so on, it will actually exacerbate the problem of transportation funding and maintaining the basic system that we have in place today. Hit the next slide. So, and these are graphs actually from around the country. One of the things that we've sort of over the recent years in the transportation system equated the fall off in vehicle miles traveled with the economic slowdown that happened starting in 2007, 2008. But what we have seen since then is that it has not followed a sharp uptick recovery like the economy has more generally. And so year over year, we keep forecasting for the purposes of sort of project scoping and so on, that we're going to see that sharp upward climb again, and yet that's not happening. So go ahead and go next. So the state right now, ODOT is working on a few different strategies to address the tightening of the belt. And I'll just go over these quickly. One has to do with the planning process. It's called least cost planning, and go to the next slide. It is a tool to help widen the scope on planning opportunities on different solution strategies before they become projects, to identify what is the very least cost solution to the problem. And actually, if you go back one, forward two. That in combination with practical design philosophy, which is, again, another strategy for stretching scarce resources as far as possible within the design of a project, can hope to start to address dealing with the transportation system that we have in a much more cost-efficient way. So, for example, one of the examples that to me is very striking, if you drive I-5 right around Roseburg, there's a very sharp turn in the road, and there are big blinking lights that say, slow your speed to 50 miles an hour, and if you don't slow down, they blink at you, and so on. And so drivers slow down going around the curves. That would have been a $200 million fix to just plow right through the rock of that turn, but it was about $1 million worth of signage. So as we start to expand our sort of tool chest of solutions beyond just wider, straighter roads and think of more creative intelligent transportation solution designs, computer systems, and so on, we have the chance to actually dramatically drive down the cost of our transportation solutions and hopefully jump past that curve in terms of the declining funding source. Go ahead and go next. And again, in terms of practical design, and this is, I think, really critical in the context of VMT particularly, which is that if we don't know that VMT is going to be on a steady upward march, and in fact, if we have good reason to want VMT to actually go down and to encourage people to use solutions that are mass transit or bike ped or whatever, then the focus ought to be on what is the most cost-efficient solution for today's problem, and not necessarily let's try and fix the problem that's going to exist 25 or 30 years from now. I think that's also particularly important in the context of what's happening in the private sector in terms of the development of technology. Go ahead and go next. So the sort of the first cut at integrating some of these ideas into the state transportation improvement program was the most recent STIP process, where before the process was sort of top down. The process now is very much bottom up. The area commissions on transportation all around the state have a direct role in the prioritization and the advancement of projects for funding. And this has really engaged everyone across the state in starting to answer the cost-benefit question of transportation programs. We did the 2015-2018 STIP was sort of a version 1.0 of a new process, and so it was a very hurried process. We had sort of just gavelled down on the plans, and then local planners and transportation folks had a very short period of time to come up with project lists and move through it, and they did actually a really wonderful job coming up with projects all around the state. What we're doing now is integrating feedback from that process in terms of improving it for the next round. Go ahead and go next. So what does the future look like? And this is, I think everything I've sort of painted so far is a little bit bleak. And if you look at all the graphs, a lot of them are going in the wrong direction. But there are some really interesting new technology development trends that have the chance to really completely upend the trade-offs that we're making today. And probably the top one, certainly the top one in my mind, is cars that can drive themselves. So right now, Google has put more than, I think, 750,000 miles on the road, vehicles driven on road by a computer. This is not just cars that can stay in a lane on a freeway or follow the car in front of you at a fixed distance. These are cars that can stop at stop signs, stop at stoplights, avoid pedestrians, avoid objects, follow the rules of the road. They'll actually stay out of the blind spots of other drivers. And this begins to point the way towards a real solution to congestion, to the problem George talked about in terms of utilization of vehicles. If you go to the next slide, what it really ushers in the potential of is a radically new form of mass transit. So we have, right now we have an individual ownership model for products that we use about 1 hour out of every day that are some of the most expensive, fastest depreciating objects that we own. And one of the reasons why we don't share them very well is because it's a hassle to share. If I hand my keys off to George, I know he's pretty much led on the foot. He's gonna, ruin my engine, and he's, well, until he takes it on. But if a computer is driving the vehicle, a computer that can drive it better than any human driver on the planet, then all of a sudden it makes a ton of sense to hand over the keys. I would much rather be in a position to say, well, hit a button on my phone, I want to ride, vehicle pulls up, takes me where I want to go, I get out, somebody else gets in. I don't have to worry about the maintenance of the vehicle. I don't have to worry about what condition I'm in when I get on the road. I can, send text messages and do Facebook status updates without fear of a high-priced ticket. And from a transit perspective, it would be by far the safest, most efficient, most convenient, most affordable transit system the world's ever seen. When I was talking to some of the folks down at Google who are working on this project, and they claim, early work claims that they'll have about a 15 times, not 15%, but 15 times better utilization of the asphalt that we already have. So 15 times better throughput of people and of goods than our cars on the road today. Go ahead and go next. And what the autonomous transit system will do is be a perfect interface for existing direct mass transit services. So one of the big problems with trains and light rail and bus lines is that they work very well if your start and destination are close to one of the station stops. This autonomous vehicle system will be a perfect last mile solution to take you to the train, drop you off right when the train shows up, you get on. When you get off, there's a vehicle waiting for you to take you to your destination. And as a result, things like bicycling become much more attractive because you're sharing the road with vehicles that actually share the road with you. Versus I'm pedaling next to a 2.5-ton vehicle with a newly minted driver sending text messages behind the wheel. That one fear, we have about right now 30% of the population that's very interested in bicycling, even 60% who would consider doing it. But the safety risk, particularly from other vehicles, is the huge barrier to getting more people on bicycles. Go ahead and go next. And if you think about it from the footprint of our urban landscape, right now something like 40% of the urban landscape is dedicated to the movement and warehousing of cars. 40%. Just so we can get from A to B, that's somewhere within the other 60%. So if you can imagine a scenario where all the vehicles that we're using are in motion in a shared fleet, we don't need the parking lots. They're using lanes at a 15 times greater efficiency, so we need many fewer lanes. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That would be our parking lots to parks initiative. And it could be to parks or to urban densification or to water refugees or to whatever. But the point is that it's going to, what we do today, which is to pave a significant chunk of our land more dead than the deadest desert on the planet, just so that we can conveniently move in our multi-passenger vehicles by ourselves. There is a much more efficient way of doing things that's just right around the corner. What was sort of Jetson's technology 5 years ago is now on the road, and the Google founders have made proclamations like 5 years to commercialization. So this is not something that the planners of tomorrow will have to deal with. This is something that planners of today need to be looking at very closely. And then one more future cool thing, next slide, is the Hyperloop. Has anybody here heard about the Hyperloop concept? So if you can imagine a trip from Eugene to Portland in 15 minutes that's more energy efficient than any vehicle on the road today, that is the promise of this concept. It was put forth by Elon Musk, the guy who has both a spaceship company and an electric car company. So I think if there's sort of one group of people on the planet who could actually pull something like this off, I would trust it to them. In any case, that concludes this rather large tour of present and future of transportation. So I'll turn it over to Carlotta.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mark. It was a wonderful presentation and wonderful, wonderful visuals as well. Our third speaker is Carlotta Collette. Carlotta is a Metro Councilor and Chair of the Joint Policy Advisory Committee for Transportation. The committee is a 17-member committee of elected officials and representatives of agencies involved in transportation that make recommendations to the Metro Council on the transportation needs of the region. Carlotta is Metro's representative on the Transit-Oriented Development Steering Committee and is council lead on the Climate Smart Communities to help the region meet statewide greenhouse gas targets set by the Oregon legislature. Before her appointment to Metro, Councilor Collette was a member of the Milwaukee City Council. For 14 years, Collette was a public involvement strategist with the fourth state Northwest Power Planning Council, now the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. The Power Council's mandate is to protect the Columbia River Basin fish and wildlife while providing adequate water for power generation, irrigation, and navigation across an area roughly the size of France. Welcome, Ms. Collette.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move kind of quickly through these first few slides. The first one, you've heard a number of the challenges we face. That the list, I think, that George presented is kind of the stuff that keeps me awake at night. Those are the issues that I worry about and think about a lot. What we do in this region, a lot of it is based on these particular challenges. As both of our speakers have mentioned, we have a growing population in our region, not just because of water refugees, but it's an attractive place to live. I mean, you look at cities on the East Coast that are losing people. Here, we are actually attracting what we call the millennials, young people, 5 times faster than any place else in the country. That leads usually to traffic congestion because if you're anticipating, as we are in this region, roughly 1 million more people coming here, a lot of those people are going to want to drive cars. And I love that George made the point that cars and cities are fundamentally incompatible. The denser we make our cities, the more difficult it is to get around in a car. But we choose a particular shape of city and in this region, and it's because of the pressures also on our farms and forests. I think most of you in this room know about Senate Bill 100, land use planning in this state. We were and still remain fundamentally an agricultural state, a forest products state, and allowing us to just pave over that incredible resource was unthinkable to former Governor McCall, and remains unthinkable to most of the people in Oregon. And then we have this changing demography. What I mentioned earlier, we have this we have the baby boomers, our generation, not you, George and my generation, and we're becoming the seniors. And when you look at these population pyramids, our pyramid is shrinking. But what's coming behind us is this huge generation of millennials, and they are about the same size as that boomer generation, maybe a little bit bigger. And luckily, as was mentioned, they have different interests than we had. I mean, in my generation, you wanted to get a car as fast as you could. It was the way to get out of the house. I mean, that was just the American dream. Next slide. So I'm going to go kind of quickly through this next series because as a Metro Councilor, you never speak out of context of land use planning in this state. It is why we do what we do, why we care about what we care about. So the thin yellow line here is the outline of our region, the Metro region. Next slide. Across the state, we protect our farms and forests, but in 2010 and 2011, in this region, we undertook a very difficult process to actually say, which acres around this region are we going to preserve for farms and forests for 50 years? And we picked about 268,000 acres. You'll notice most of it is in Washington County. That's for 2 reasons. One is that Washington County has some of the biggest pressures to grow because they have flat land that's open that industries love, and they have some of the best topsoil on the planet. And so we weighed in on that and agreed as a region, all 3 counties and Metro, that we had to protect that farmland. Next slide. We also agreed in 1995 and 2006, the voters in this region approved money to go to Metro to buy land that we wanted to protect, sometimes because it was upland water habitat, it was stream side, it was to protect clean air, to protect our rivers, to protect special kinds of habitat like white oak savannas that are important for fish and wildlife. Next slide. We also protect our streams and stream corridors, and we have state regs and metro regional regulations that actually protect these corridors. You're noticing that the urban footprint where people live is actually getting smaller here. Next slide. The gray area is basically where we live, and it's mostly single-family neighborhoods. It's the kind of stuff that most of us live in. Most of us love that model. In the Portland area, it's mostly 5,000 square foot lots, 50 by 100. As you get out into the suburbs, people want more and more land. But again, with those population pressures, we have to be very careful about how efficiently we use that land. Next slide. So at the same time that we identified this big green band around the region of land that we would preserve for farms and forests, we identified a much, much smaller amount of land into which we could grow when we need to urbanize and expand the urban growth boundary. The blue areas make up about 28,000 acres. It's where we plan to grow over the next 50 years. It amounts to about an 11% increase in the footprint of the region at the same time that we anticipate the region's population growing by 60%. So significant challenge here. How do we bring this land in? How do we make the best use of what's inside the urban growth boundary? How do we protect all that land that we need to protect? Because even if it's not for farms and forests, even if it's not for grass seed, at some point we may need to eat what we can produce, because of all the other conflicts going on the planet. And that land is absolutely critical. So these blue spaces are sort of the hope for where we can grow. And they're located near our cities, our existing cities. The light blue spaces that just came up are industrial lands. We figure we need to live here, but we also need to have jobs here. And we asked all of our counties and cities to help us identify what existing industrial land could we still grow into. This is one of the maps that we came up with. The next one. We also looked at the map and said, where are there other kinds of employment land? Because not everything is going to be an industry. Some of it might be a shopping mall or a business park, or there's all kinds of employment lands. So these green places are new, underdeveloped or undeveloped, currently existing in our region employment lands. Next one. And then in 1995, this region did a really bold step. It was really one of the first regions in the United States to look out, again, 50 years into the future and say, how are we going to grow as communities? We could just keep growing out. Every 5 years, we look at the urban growth boundary and we could just keep spreading out, and everybody could have as big a lot as they want, and we'd take up most of northern Oregon eventually. We could say, well, we're not going to grow much inside this region, but we're going to grow in the small towns around the region. Or we could say, maybe there's a new model. Maybe what we should look at is, what are the places in the region that people are going to want to live, that are easy to add more people, to make it more fun and attractive and pleasant to live there? What are those places? And maybe we link those places with high-capacity transit. The yellow dots here are all station areas on either the blue line, the red line, the yellow line up interstate, the green light rail line down through Clackamas County, or the orange line, which I also am. I've spent my entire political career trying to get this orange line built, so I'm a little biased. But those are station areas, and we figure if we're going to spend the kind of money we are to build a high-capacity transit system, we ought to make sure that people can walk off that train, pick up their groceries, maybe pick up their dry cleaning, maybe live right there, maybe go to a school right there, or coffee shop. That's a big one. And so we really want to see development focusing around those light rail stations. The two big dots are the main business areas, the downtown Portland and downtown Vancouver. The medium-sized purple dots, next size down, are what we call regional centers. And again, this was a process agreed to by the region. About 20,000 people participated in this public process, which is pretty unique. So those regional centers are places like Beaverton, Hillsborough, Gresham. They're towns that could grow, that wanted to grow and could add population. And again, the intent was they would all be linked by high-capacity transit. The smaller lavender circles are town centers that want to stay as kind of small towns. Milwaukee, I live in one. There's a number of them here, small towns all around our region. But the idea is that we focus on how can we best serve those communities without having everybody who lives there have to drive a car to get a loaf of bread. You ought to be able to walk, take a bus, take a bike, somehow other than having to use a car for every single trip. So next one. The other thing we looked at as a region was this notion that there are important corridors, transportation corridors, and a lot of these are the old streetcar lines. We looked back at that model of streetcar city, which is what Portland was, and said, boy, that made a ton of sense, that people could jump on the streetcar, ride to the little grocery store. In Barcelona, they tried to set it up so that everybody had every service they would need within 20 blocks. I mean, that's pretty nice. I mean, you can just walk around, take a bus, take your bicycle. The intent is similar to that with this model. So the next one. All of this goes together to be what we adopted in 1995 as the 2040 Regional Growth Concept Map. And, I swear that this shows up in every single Metro employee and council member's slideshow at some point, because fundamentally, we don't think about transportation as getting from point A to point B. We don't think about just moving cars and moving trucks. We think about moving goods, as George mentioned, but we also think about whole communities and what that means. What does it mean to live in a place where you can get what you need without having to use a car, so that the pressures of people moving here are concentrated in certain areas that are residential, but then also served by transit and higher capacity means of getting around. Next one. So Metro sort of sits in the middle of all of this. We're the only elected regional government. I think there's a second one now in Louisiana, but we're the oldest regionally elected government. And our role really is, next one, to start, and just keep going through these, to start getting the cities, the counties, professional groups like the builders and industries, nonprofit groups, and all the citizens together to understand this concept that I just showed you, but also to try to work out then what does that mean for our communities? What does that mean for my neighborhood? What does that mean for my neighbors, for my friends, my community? How do I get to work in this model? We are the convener. We work with the cities, the counties, NGOs, professional groups, citizens, all of these, because frankly, when the two questions that were asked, who pays for transportation and who's in charge, everybody's paying for transportation, and everybody ought to have a little skin in the game, frankly. And in some parts of my district, sometimes I think there's an interest in voting on too many small things, but I think that fundamentally we need to know what the consequences are. So next one. So each of our communities has identified employment lands and industrial places that they think they can put people to work. Next one. They've identified in different ways what an employment center means to them. It might be something that's still in the planning stage. It might be an cute old downtown that has a lot of coffee shops and restaurants. It might be something as new as the Pearl, or over like an educational institution that puts a ton of people to work. Next one. We also asked the neighborhoods and cities, particularly cities, to identify how and where people would want to live in their communities. So you have these single-family residential neighborhoods, and they're dear to the heart of most of us. You also have these cute little downtowns like Milwaukee, my little downtown. What you don't see in this picture is off on the right is actually our first downtown redevelopment in about 40 years. It's called North Main Village, and it includes about 60 units of affordable housing, and I think another 120 or 140 units of townhomes and condos, and it enables people to live right downtown Milwaukee. Similarly, the one on the far lower right is the newest one. It's just finishing up construction. It's called the Prescott. It's up on the interstate, the yellow line. I always think of Kenton as sort of the poster child. If light rail can help to revitalize Kenton, it can do it anywhere, because Kenton was a pretty tough place to live for a long time. And I'm thinking not just because of crime, but because you couldn't walk to anything. You couldn't get to anything. And now we have apartment buildings like this going in that has 20% of it is affordable housing. These apartments are all looking out on a bocce court, which, that's kind of interesting. It's really a pretty high service housing development, and the lower floors are going to have things like brew pub, coffee shops, restaurants, maybe a cleaner, a number of different kinds of businesses. So the next one. We also asked each city in the region to identify how are people going to get around on foot and on bicycle. So what are your priorities for sidewalks? I mean, a lot of our region, the parts of our region that were built in the 60s, 70s, they were built without sidewalks. The early neighborhoods all had sidewalks, and nowadays you wouldn't think to build a neighborhood without a sidewalk. But my neighborhood just got sidewalks about 10 years ago, so and it was hell to pay. I mean, there was a lot of battle over getting those sidewalks because it took up some people's front yards. But that was one of the things we asked our cities to do. Next one. We also asked our cities through these transportation system plans, is the technical term for it, to identify how they want to get around on buses. We need more frequent buses, whether or not they want MAX and how MAX might serve their communities, how all of this works as a system. Next one. So we're pretty cool in this region. I mean, people come from all over the world to the Portland metro region and take tours all the time of how we did this, why we did this. I mean, we really stand out. We drive 20% fewer miles every day than average regions our size. Joe Courtwright from Eco Northwest tried to calculate what that means in dollar savings, and he figures that we save more than $1 billion in transportation costs because we don't have to have all those cars on the highway. We don't have to extend urban highways or urban streets out into our farms and forests. We saved $1.5 billion in time in what's called the cost of congestion. So we actually have reduced people's time that they wait in traffic, with the exception of George Beard, who has had a rough morning. And I can identify with that. Right now, we have a lot of projects going on in this region, and I'm excited for them. We're building 2 bridges. We're building a light rail system. We're repairing roads. And it slows things down. But those savings, just from having a smarter transportation system, have put $2.5 billion back into our local economy. Next one. But we still face a lot of other challenges, and that's why I called this presentation the 21st century slot, the transportation system, because we face all those things that George was talking about, and also what Mark was talking about in terms of climate change. This region was given a mandate to meet state targets of greenhouse gas reductions in transportation, and we're working on it, and I'll give you a quick report at the end here. But we also have had incredible federal disinvestment in infrastructure nationwide. Used to be that when you built a light rail line, you could get about a 75% match from the federal government. The Orange Line, we got a 50% match, and we didn't hear about it until literally weeks before we were ready to sign the papers. And as chair of JPAC, I had to figure where I was going to get another $125 million really fast. And that took a lot of work. We also have political deadlock in DC. So this federal disinvestment, I don't expect to see a whole lot of hope on that horizon. We are blessed to have the political team that we have in Oregon, because I think our legislature does move and does make good changes and important things for our community. But at least in my district, and I think to some degree statewide, we are also facing taxpayer revolt. And I don't think it's just because people don't want to pay for what they use. Sometimes they don't know that they need to pay for what they use. But there is also a lot of poverty. And when our economy crashed in 2008, trillions of dollars just left the planet or went to the hands of some bankers. I looked at some salaries of bankers on Wall Street, and they make enough in a year to build a light rail line. That made me want to throw up. I'm sorry, but that was just, I saw one guy whose salary was like $500 million a year. And I thought, there's something plain criminal about that. When I hustle as hard as I do to get a few $1 million for a sidewalk for Milwaukee, and this guy makes $500 million a year. I won't go too far on there, but next one. So how do we make it in our 21st century? How do we get anything done, given all of that, and given the fear and given the constraints? The number one thing we do is we form these partnerships. We don't build anything without a team anymore. We can't. Everybody has got to pitch in. We don't build just a street from here to here. We have to have broad vision. We have to think about, okay, what do we want our community to look like? What is it? What is at point A and what is at point B? And what are all the points in between that people want to get to? And we can't just think in terms of cars or trucks. We have to think multimodal, because as George pointed out, for every bike that's out there, that's one less car. For every bus that's out there, I don't know how many less cars that is, but it's a lot less. And we should be genuflecting to the walkers out there, because they are saving us from having to work those streets and build more, wider, expensive highway projects. And the other thing we learned is that we kind of have to phase things, because nobody's going to come up with $1.4 billion overnight. We have to take things in steps and do what we can, and when we see money, we have to be fast and nimble and have that team in place to get it. Next one. So I want to tell you about two 21st century transportation projects that are going on in the region right now. This first one is the East Metro Connections Plan. This was one where the cities of Gresham, Fairview, Troutdale, Wood Village, Multnomah County, the citizens of East Multnomah County, Clackamas County and some of its cities, ODOT, TriMet, the Port of Portland, and Metro all got together and solved a problem that had been sitting on the books for like 20 years. And the issue was, how do we get from Highway 84 to Highway 26 and build a network to connect up some industrial land in the middle and on the edges of that area? Next slide. And it was based on our last regional transportation plan, which took a very different look at transportation planning. And in fact, the federal government is sort of looking at that as a model. We said, what are the outcomes we want to achieve as a community? Not just moving people and goods, but what are the total outcomes? Things like justice, like protecting farms and protecting forests and green spaces. How do we make all those part of a transportation plan? Next one. So for the East Multnomah Connections Plan, they said, yeah, we want to support north and south connectivity. That's a big part of this plan, but we also want to make use of what we have. We want to make sure that we're developing a lot of different solutions. We're very concerned about economic vitality out here. We want to make sure that the benefits and burdens of growth are fair, that they're distributed fairly, that we enhance the livability and the safety out here in our communities where people want to live and work and play. And we want to support local land use visions. And some of these communities were just starting to cook up a land use vision, and this helped them understand what it was they were really going for. And finally, we want to not just, not hurt the natural environment, but is there a way we can do this and make it better? Next one. And they did, and they worked for a good year and a half, and they started with what everyone starts with, a list of projects. We want to get this done and this interchange and all these different projects. They started bundling the projects, and then they said things like, well, if we're going to widen the road in front of McMinimans, maybe we ought to think about what else we want to have out by Edgefield, for example. Is that something that we want to be thinking about? Do we want more of a town around there? And the communities got their act together and really pulled together these bundled visions for what they wanted to have happen out there. And they bundled them into what they call investment packages. Next one. And the key theme here was that the projects all had to have consensus, which does not mean that everybody says they're perfect, but that everybody agreed, let's go forward on these. They had to be implementable, which meant some certain pipe dreams were just off the table because, frankly, we don't have the money and we can't implement them. And they had to be such that we could model their performance as we started to build them. We could say, are we doing the right thing here? We really want to make sure that we're not wasting money. Next one. So you will be seeing over the next 10 years probably a lot of changes in these communities. Gresham Vista Business Park, around McMinimans Edgefield, Fairview Village, Troutdale, downtown Gresham, Mount Hood Community College, Rockwood and Wood Village. These are all communities that got together, worked together, came up with a shared vision, and we've begun funding them. We've been able to find this past year around $10 million in state and federal dollars that we were able to put towards this, but again, each community is also coming up with some of the money to build this. Next one. The second project I want to talk about is the Southwest Corridor Plan, and similarly, and I'm going to really breeze through this one because I'm running out of time, 8 cities got together, and if you live anywhere near Barber Boulevard, you'll know, and 99E through Tigard, you know what a nightmare that part of our region is. Next one. It's actually a place where we have 11% of the metro region. Population is expected to go from about 140,000, which is what we have now there, to about 206,000 people. Employees, 163,000 to 251,000. And this is a community that wants to grow, that wants to see these changes happening, but they want to keep their really lovely single-family neighborhoods, and I'm all for it. So the idea they came up with are these little circles mark what are the essential things that we have in our community. They're not even talking yet about transportation. What are the essential things in our community? Things like education, entertainment, jobs, retail. How do we surround those with stable residential neighborhoods? Then they started thinking about how do we link those things, not just to each other, but also to regional, important regional places. How do we make the best use of our little main streets and our little neighborhood centers? And then how do we infill and redevelop as we're moving forward? Next one. They again came up with a huge list. I'm not going to go through this, but some of it was roadway, some of it was active transportation, some of it is actually downtown redevelopment. Next one. High-capacity transit is a part of that plan because this is a huge corridor, and they felt that in order to implement our community village vision, we need to either have light rail or bus rapid transit. It's going to be a very heavy lift for this community. This is going to cost a lot of money, and they're in the queue, but it's going to be an expensive project. Okay. Okay, quick, next one. And then the last piece is that we are working on this state climate smart scenarios project. The first look at the results is that we are, next slide, with the plans we have in place, we can meet the state targets. Next one. We have to implement the plans that we have. We have to keep investing in those communities. We keep going. So here's what a normal street looks like. Next one. We start adding in the means to make it more convenient for people. Next one. And the next one. And we just start building these very walkable communities. These are the plans that people want to see. Keep going. It's okay. And we have to help them build those plans. Next one. We have to invest in those communities if we're going to keep our greenhouse gas down. And we never even thought about greenhouse gases in the beginning. We were just thinking about protecting farms and forests. Transit's absolutely critical to meeting greenhouse gas targets. And I think that's it. And my only caveat is that we need more money to do all of that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tobias, because we'll be down at the legislature in 2015.
Thank you very, very much, Carlotta. We don't have much time for our rep, who's going to tell us everything that's going on. Tobias Reed is chair of the Oregon House Committee on Transportation and Economic Development. That committee is a standing committee of the House. In 2011, the Transportation and Sustainability and Economic Development Committees were consolidated into the present committee. Representative Reed is also a member of the Committee on Revenue, the Committee on Tax Credits, the Joint Committee on Ways and Means, and of Ways and Means Subcommittee on Transportation and Economic Development. He co-chairs the Committee on the I-5 Bridge Replacement Project. That's a fun one. Representative Reed remains an ex officio member of the Oregon Innovation Council and the Oregon Business Development Commission. In the 2012 legislative session, Representative Reed headed the effort to pass the Oregon Investment Act, a bill he drafted with Treasurer Ted Wheeler, Governor John Kitzhaber, and others. The OIA created a single board to find the best ways to get developing businesses and the support they need. The bill passed with broad bipartisan support. So a very diverse individual, and he's going to tell us how the legislature is going to handle this transportation challenge.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I'm tempted to start with that great line from Mo Udall, who said on several occasions that everything that needs to be said has been said, but not everyone has said it. So there's an up and a downside to being the last person in a panel like this, and often those things the effects can be counted in both columns. As I was listening to the presentations that went before me, I found myself alternating between hoping that they might not say something so that I might have a chance to say something, and then being relieved when they did say it as I'm looking at the clock. So there's less that I have to cover. I agree with nearly everything that has been said before me, and I hope I might just add a few embellishments and talk about at least one thing that I really care about that nobody else talked about, so I'm glad for that. The first thing I think is to recognize that we are here amongst an unusual group of people. It's a weeknight. There are a lot of other things you could be doing, and you've decided to spend some time with us talking about transportation. That puts all of us in a distinct minority. And the fact is that a lot of people don't care about transportation, don't think about transportation, don't think about the challenges that entails. So all of us have a role in helping to bring that message to our friends, neighbors, and families, and that's why the work that the League of Women Voters is doing is so important. But even if you accept that transportation is important, there are a lot of other things that are important that we all care about, that our values motivate us to care about. So I think in the legislature, one of the challenges is figuring out how to sort of find a place where you can start taking something on, because everything is connected. And for me, I've tried to make my my legislative major economic growth. For me, that's important because economic growth enables us to do all the other things that we want to do, to choose to invest in education and opportunity and all of those things. So in the long run, there's only three things I think that any individual state can do to separate itself from the trends of the globe and the country, and infrastructure is one of those very important things. Education and innovation, I think, are the other two. So that's why I think transportation and infrastructure matters, no matter what else you care about. Others have talked about the team approach that is required here, and that's certainly true. All of us can impact places where we work, but we're also dependent on what's happening elsewhere. Tomorrow I'm actually going to a conference in Washington, D.C., and it's pretty hard to not recognize how important that what happens there is to what we can do here. It's also really important to recognize the role of the private sector in our team. Mark talked about the Google car, and I have to say we had some hearings on that general concept in the last legislative session, and I was very disappointed by the attitude displayed by some of our partners, and I say that word deliberately, in the private sector. We have a role in the state government, not only in terms of finance, but also in terms of policy ground. We want to make sure, at least I want to make sure, that we are thinking ahead about what changes we might or might not need to make sure that we can benefit from the promise of autonomous cars, and beyond that Oregon might play a role in the development of that industry and that technology. And we've got, in order to do that, we have to be thinking proactively and thinking long ahead about what kinds of changes we need to make. The specific thing I want to talk about, thankfully no one else talked about it so far, is something called the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it is an enormously important and exciting concept that allows us to stretch taxpayer dollars for better outcomes on publicly owned infrastructure. Started as a multi-state and actually international effort, a collaboration between British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And the basic premise is that by standardizing some of our permitting and procurement processes, we can bundle projects to a degree that they might be interesting to private sector dollars, whether that's pension funds or a lot of other kinds of dollars that are looking for the kinds of solid, reliable investments that infrastructure represents. And at the same time, we're looking to build an Oregon center of expertise that can help make those projects go. The Multnomah County Courthouse is already a pilot project in that effort, and there are a variety of other things that allow us to ask not just how do we build something in the most inexpensive way, but how do we deliver the best outcomes over the useful life of the asset. We have heard a lot of great examples, one being the Sea to Sky Highway in British Columbia, where the sponsoring entity, in this case Partnerships BC, asks, instead of saying, this is the road, this is the specific design, how much will it cost to build it, they talk about outcomes, what they want to deliver and what they can afford, and then open up the process to qualified proposers who deliver some innovative approaches and can deliver on better outcomes. So that, I think, is one of the real keys for us as we recognize that our own ability to finance needed infrastructure is far less than what we will need over the next couple of decades. I would just close with one observation that transportation is consistent with what I observe to be one of the problems of our political structure and process generally, that we're not very good at thinking about things long out into the future. We tend to be better at thinking the things that are immediate crises. And of course, there's the Churchill line about Americans doing the right things after we've exhausted all the other possibilities, that maybe was a little unfairly applied to Americans. I think you might say that about humans. So we've got to do what we can to be thinking about the long range. And I think part of that also means we have to be very deliberate in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. So many of these complicated infrastructure projects can get bogged down when the forces of inertia are allowed to prevail. When you can find some reason to say no, when you can find some reason to say that design doesn't satisfy every one of my concerns. Maybe you've encountered there's an acronym that I particularly like. Everybody knows, I'm sure, NIMBY, not in my backyard, but I've encountered recently another one, BANANA, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. There are banana people in the world, and we have to be ready to make some compromises and continue trying to improve things. So I hope as you venture out into the world, you will take the varied views from this group and look for opportunities to engage people in the conversation about transportation. Because even if you're not an active user of any particular mode or transportation asset, we are all beneficiaries of a good transportation system that works together. Even if we're just consumers, we all need the transportation system that works. So I don't want to be the last person standing between you and questions for very long. I appreciate you listening to me and hope we'll have some good discussion. And I hope you will also excuse me when I depart rather rapidly. I have 2 young kids at home that I'm hoping to see before they're asleep tonight. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Now, before we go to audience questions, do you folks have questions or comments to and for each other?
I think we want to hear from the audience.
Yeah, okay. Well, I want to start off with one, and I want to, first of all, clarify something for my own benefit that you said, Tobias, and you had mentioned, I think, and please correct me, that there was some thinking about bundling infrastructure projects to make them attractive to private sector investors. Does that carry with it a privatization aspect, whereas private sector folks would own what we commonly think of as public infrastructure?
That's not contemplated in what we're talking about. We want to make sure that instead of thinking just about design and build in a particular asset's life cycle, we're thinking about designing, building, operating, maintaining. But we would be talking about publicly owned infrastructure. There'd be arrangements potentially around operations, maintenance of those sorts of things, but it would remain in public ownership.
Okay, great. And I was getting curious during the discussion. You all are so articulate and so headed in the right direction for the future, and you all have different roles to play. And I'm curious, and I think we all would like to learn, how do you work together? How do the best ideas or what you're talking about bubble up, and what's your role, Mark? What's your role? How do you convene, and how do things bubble up? I think the last step would be the legislature, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts, and if you can share how you all share ideas and how the best ideas get from here to there.
I can take a first stab at it, and then it always does end up at the legislature.
Sometimes it starts there too.
Sometimes it starts there too. Absolutely. In our region, we work with the local governments, but we also work. I'm an alternate on the rail committee with Mark. I was on the STIP committee that Mark mentioned. George and I have worked together on electric vehicles work. So a lot of what we spend a lot of times. I've worked a lot with Portland Bureau of Transportation. So we do work a lot together, and in every community there's some really brilliant people that come up with great ideas, and PBOT just shoots out great ideas all the time, and we over at Metro try to grab them and see if we can't help implement them. So there's some really, this is a very creative region for transportation in particular, but for a lot of other things, and so we do work a lot together. We a lot of us are Facebook friends, we share information that way. And ultimately we raise a lot of local money. Every project we do takes a match. Light rail being one example, it's 50-50 with the federal government. But usually we need to get some money from the state. We need to get money from all local communities as well. So there's no way any community does this in a vacuum anymore.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to just trump that one really quickly. Quick story. But we're very, across institutions, we're very intimate. People know each other. We work well together. When I bring in external partners from outside of Oregon, and I'm thinking about some work we've done with Toyota Motor Sales, they were floored. They said, I can't believe how nice people are, how well they work together. This is so unlike California and the other states in which we work. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is that we only have, 2 Fortune 500 companies here. We don't have a lot of money, so we have to work laterally. Mm-hmm. And we do. We know each other, and we like each other. Seriously, it's kind of our secret sauce.
The stone soup approach,
and I think that's I think that's absolutely true. But it's worth expanding on just a moment, because it might be easy if I were in the audience. I might find myself imagining, well, that sounds nice, because here are 4 people who said largely the same things. But it's not just true amongst people like us who agree. Earlier today, I was in Eugene at an Association of Oregon Counties event, and I was sitting at the front of the table with another Democrat and 2 Republicans. And there are plenty of things we disagree on, but we're able to remain productive and continue working for those good solutions. So I agree with you, George.
We always surprise folks back in D.C. when we go back as a region to ask for money for transportation projects, and we go back and we've all gotten together and prioritized, and people will say, well, first thing we want to get done is the Selwood Bridge. Washington County's saying that. We're saying that. Everybody, we agree on this list of priorities that we need funded, and it's so helpful for our delegation, because they come back and say, thank you for not making me make the decisions about what gets funded. We collaborate, and part of it is Metro, because we have this forum at JPACT, but part of it is that I think we keep our eye on the goal.
Thank you very much.
And that was actually, that was consistent actually across the state with the STIP process, feedback that we heard really from every corner of the state, as far as we had created a process where people actually work together effectively. And I think from the commission perspective, it's really, how do we continue to tweak that process to have better outcomes? Mm-hmm. What's the right mindset people need to go into the discussion having? And I think even back to the governor laid out a series of sort of high-level precepts for the commission when he came on board, and one of the top ones was, are all the right people at the table having the conversation? And just setting the stage right has a huge impact.
I think we're very fortunate. Here's a question from our audience. Vancouver and Clark County seem to have different attitudes and ethics about transportation. How can we bring them along with our vision?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, they might say the same thing about us.
Yeah.
And therein lies the challenge. I think it continues to be a matter of those personal relationships, and I don't have a much more sophisticated answer than that.
Well, and I can add that we have three folks from Vancouver who sit on JPACT. So I have Council Member Jack Berkman, who's on the Vancouver City Council. We have Clark County Commissioner Steve Stewart, and then WashDOT sends somebody who also sits on it, Washington DOT. So we talk all the time. We're Facebook friends too. And so even though there's certainly some of the citizens over there are mixed, there's certainly a lot of discontent over some transportation projects, but we still worked very, very cooperatively together. And good people got reelected in Vancouver this last round. Some very good people. Mayor Levitt and Jack Berkman both got reelected. Thank you. I think that's a good sign.
Thank you very, very much, Councillor. This will conclude the televised portion of our meeting this evening. It's been a wonderful, wonderful experience for all of us, very knowledgeable and very informative and very hopeful. Thanks, everybody, very, very much.